Welcome to the Wesley Centre's Conversations That Matter series. This conversation is on the ethics of voting, where we ask things like, what is government for? What are the big issues this federal election? And what are our moral obligations towards others when we go to the voting booth? It is a lightly edited version of a conversation recorded on the 20th of March, 2025 in Melbourne. I'm Robyn Whitaker, Director of the Wesley Centre, and I hope you enjoy what follows. What we're hoping to do today is have that bigger picture conversation about the nature of our democracy, our moral obligations to one another when we vote, and the role of government in building the kind of society we might hope to see. So I'm delighted to have two very experienced political leaders, and I will introduce the one sitting right next to me now. Bronwyn Pike will be known to many of you, I'm sure. She's currently CEO of Uniting VicTas, and prior to that was a Member of Parliament for Melbourne from 1999 to 2012, making her one of the longest-serving female Labor politicians in this state. During her time in government, Bronwyn served as Labor Minister for a variety of portfolios, including community services, housing, aged care, health, education, and skills and workplace participation. John Pesutto is a lawyer by training and operated his own legal practice, as well as being a senior fellow at Melbourne University's School of Government. He was a member for Hawthorn from 2014 to 2018, and again since 2022, the year he was also elected leader of the Victorian Liberal Party, or the opposition. During his time in Parliament, John has served as Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Education, Child Protection, and also as Shadow Attorney General. I could say a lot more about both of you, but in the interest of just getting the conversation going, I want to start with a really big picture question, which is, what is government for? What can we expect our government to do for us as a community?
It's an absolute honour and delight to be here today. I think you have to go back to first principle. The basic things you have to do: keep people safe, keep the country secure and as prosperous as it can be, to generate the food we need, the transport systems we need, the health systems we need. At a high level, they're the more immediate material things that I think a government has to do. When you delve down deeper, for me, into the more metaphysical points about what it's all about, I think it's about asking ourselves, what does a civilised people need to do collectively to provide opportunities for people to live happily and freely? That saying from the Enlightenment period, the pursuit of happiness, which meant more than just those words, of course. It was the ability to live a civilised life where you could have the basics provided to you, live freely, also achieve a kind of cohesion that we struggle with even today. So that's how I would break it down.
Oh, absolutely. John and I agree on lots of things.
We're hoping for some disagreement.
We sometimes have to cook up things to disagree with each other on. It's interesting when this question, I kind of couldn't help but go back to Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, the of the people, by the people, for the people. And in the end, good government gathers up the aspirations of people to live their best lives. And so the responsibility is to pass laws that are fair on everyone, not just one group of people, to provide those kind of services that are important for people to be able to live their best lives, to provide opportunity so that people can grow and develop and fulfil themselves as human beings. And then I think, as John said, that protecting role, protecting the environment, protecting the country, protecting each other, that's all what good government's about.
Thank you. I wonder if government is under threat, or maybe our democracy, I hate to bring in America so soon, but are we seeing the effects of American politics here? But I partly asked this question, the Scanlon Institute, who maps social cohesion, has measured that social cohesion is now at the lowest point it's been in Australia since they started tracking it in 2007. And that's measuring things like people's sense of belonging, political participation, inclusion, and sense of justice in the community. And they also link social cohesion. When social cohesion lowers, so does trust in government. How much should we be worried about that? Do you have a sense, as people who've both been involved in the political scene for a long time, that things are shifting in some way? And how concerned should we be about those shifts?
There certainly are some indicators that are a bit worrying. So since 1925, we've had compulsory voting here in Australia and very high participation in compulsory voting. So round about the 95-96%. It was only in 2022 that the number of people who were eligible to vote fell below, who didn't vote and who weren't enrolled to vote, fell below 90%. And that actually is 1.7 million eligible voters didn't even bother to turn up. And if you correlate that with some of the figures around people's lack of trust in government, I mean, let's face it, we've always known that politicians are deeply unpopular. They kind of rate alongside used car salesmen and
I strongly disagree with
that. Real estate agents.
And lawyers, sorry. Yours got double.
And lawyers, yeah, double whammy.
2 out of 3.
I think there are some worrying signs. There's also that at the last election, none of the two major parties got over 40% of the vote, whereas that has not been a situation historically. 30% of voters voted for an alternative than the two major parties. But it is that sense that there's less trust, less confidence, less belief that government can actually deliver for the longer term. That is also part of that research. So it is something we need to be very vigilant about to protect our democracy.
Some of the observations I'd make are that I've always looked at the broad arc and span of the history of democracy and politics, as a lot of people who are involved in politics do. I don't see this as unprecedented, the age we're going through. You go back to Thucydides, who spoke about Athens being torn apart by those people who wanted to see all sides of the question and those who prevailed by being demagogic. That's where the word comes from, to be a demagogue. It's always been a tension in public affairs, because to govern, and Bronwyn's the only one on the altar who's actually governed. I hope to do that one day. But when you're governing, you have to bring a whole lot of pieces together. And that often involves compromises. So some of your supporters will not be happy, your detractors won't be happy, no one will be happy. But the art and craft of leadership and statespersonship is to be able to deliver an outcome and say, this is the best, and I know you, my opponents, don't like it, and you, my supporters, don't like it either. You wanted me to be pure. You, on the other hand, wanted me to be extreme. But you've got to find that medium which delivers it. And that, frankly, is really frustrating for a lot of people. And one of the reasons I think we're seeing what we're seeing in the United States is I don't try to train my thoughts obsessively on President Trump, because I actually think the problem is not actually about him. He's just the manifestation of a lot of things that are going on over there and which represent an ever-present threat to democracy, which is the idea that democracy is frustrating in many ways, and it's why some types of authoritarian leaders are appealing to people, because they will just get it done. That's where that saying, Mussolini ran the trains on time. That's not a comment about convenience of the punctuality of train services. That's actually a statement that having one person in charge who is not accountable, doesn't face scrutiny, and can dispense whatever form of justice that autocrat thinks is appropriate in the circumstances, that's okay. And as we know, that's not the way democracy really works or is intended to work. So in the United States, you've got that frustration. I think also, just to take up some of the points that Bronwyn made, I support compulsory voting in this country. I know there's a debate about whether voting should be compulsory or voluntary. I like that it is compulsory. It's actually compulsory attendance. You don't have to vote if you don't want to. And for the record, everybody should vote formally. But, we have compulsory. But the reason I say this, Robyn, is that in the United States, one of the essential features of their electoral process is driving out the vote, because it is voluntary. And what that tends to do is it fuels polarisation, because to get your vote out, you have to agitate your base. And what does that mean? It means going further to the margins rather than trying to bring people in. And that's why in Congress now you don't see as much across the aisle stuff, whereas here, thankfully I think, parties do have to work together and there's not that dynamic. It's a very unhealthy dynamic in my view. And even I'll be candid about this, we looked at some software as parties do a few years back, and it was American software. And it was very clear to myself and others that I'm not sure I like this software, because what it was designed to do was drive out the vote. And we actually, whilst we have a problem with attendance at voting, in the Paran by-election, I think Rachel Westaway in her inaugural speech last night spoke about, 15,000 people not voting who could have. So we do have a problem with it, but it's not of the proportions that you see in the United States. So it's an ever-present challenge tending to democracy.
Can we pick up on this polarisation issue? Because I think I agree with you. I do sometimes wonder if the social cohesion stuff is as bad as people make it out to be, in that we've had periods in history where we've been deeply divided over specific issues. I think social media and the internet has changed the landscape in that it's increasingly hard to actually determine truth from misinformation and disinformation. Do either of you want to comment on that? I mean, do we need higher standards? How do we actually ensure that what is factually correct is cutting through, when the temptation, even by mainstream media organisations, is to actually run the sensational headlines?
Well, in fact, media itself has become polarised as well. So there's left-wing media and there's right-wing media, and, you've got the BBC and the ABC and public broadcasters in the US, trying to keep the middle ground, but it's increasingly difficult. And John, I totally agree with you. I mean, you can just look all the way back through history and find times when there are autocrats and dictators and, people's rights and their very lives were threatened by all of that. But the fueling of information through social media, I think, is a very much a new dynamic, and the capacity to be able to get misinformation out there and have it unchecked and verified. Of course, whilst we bemoan that, the truth is that even lies can only reinforce what people are feeling inside. So, if you look at groups of people who are feeling disenfranchised, their jobs have been taken away, the industries they worked in don't exist anymore, they don't seem to be able to find a place in society. I mean, we've got an epidemic of loneliness, of people being disconnected from each other. Then all of this stuff is just like petrol on the embers. So is it cause? Is it effect? I mean, I think it's incredibly complex and does present a huge challenge for people who, as John said, are trying to actually get stuff done in the interest of the whole community, because they're just always tackling that polarity. On the one hand, you want to appeal to people, and so sometimes that means you lack authenticity because you're scared, If you're a politician and you really said what you were thinking sometimes, which is probably most of the time, you'd think, oh, well, that's going to alienate a whole lot of people. So people say, oh, I hate politicians. They just, always give lines. They always, they're not authentic. On the other hand, you've got the media who are highly polarised, just begging for the gotcha moment. So you can't be authentic because you're going to get got. So, this kind of creates a very challenging environment.
I certainly think with social media platforms, they've created a kind of turbocharged environment for debate. And, I start this part of the conversation with the question, what should the public square look like? If you were the architects of a public square where people are to debate issues, what would it look like and what protections would you put in place? I think for my part, I'm less concerned with lies because lies should carry their own consequences. If you want to make stuff up and say it, then I'm confident in the checks and balances of our democracy and our debate for that to get called out, and it's the job of the detractors to point out and discredit those arguments. I'm less concerned about that because that is more easily reckoned with. Not easy, when I say easy, I don't mean it's easy. It's more easily reckoned with than the bigger threats to the public square that I think come in the form of vilification, which is a more systemic threat to democracy when people are maligned or vilified because of attributes that they live with. There's that aspect, and then there's the mental health aspects, which I think are a legitimate basis for policy to ensure that debate doesn't put people either in an individual sense in the runway of harm or people of certain classes and attributes who will also suffer.
I think the lies, though, John, that can, however, fuel the vilification. So often there's a very human characteristic that, when things aren't going well for us, we can blame others. So, it's that person. I hear it a lot, from a lot of young men. Why are those women getting a leg up, or why is that migrant coming in and taking my job? We've got a shortage of housing, why have we got so many international students? And the lack of honesty in the conversation can, fuel that kind of vilification as well.
Yeah, and so by lies, I should point out, I'm not defending lies, I'm just saying that
the truth will find you out.
Well, but also that includes things like us, my colleagues on my side of the aisle saying of someone on the Labor side, you hate employers and you hate homeowners. That's you could argue that equally when people say you hate public health or something. It's just ridiculous. It's not true, but
it happens all the time in Parliament, though, John.
But that's what I mean. And I'm less. In terms of our democracy, that's just part of the robustness and that'll get sorted out. It's those threats to cohesion, stability and individual health that I think are, for me, the highest priorities in managing the square.
Yep. So let's turn to, we've named a few things, and of course, when people are struggling with whatever it is, we've got loneliness, we've got a sense of belonging, social cohesion, and of course, cost of living is one of the big issues. Our temptation is to scapegoat and to look for people to blame. I'm interested what you both think are going to be the big federal issues. We did a little Facebook poll and cost of living topped the list, followed by climate change, interestingly. I'm interested what you think the big issues are. I'm also interested in what you think they should be. Like, what are the issues we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
With the upcoming federal
With the upcoming, thinking federally as a country rather than state level, although either.
Oh, look, I would go with cost of living. I think I would say climate change and energy because I think there are aspects to the debate that they're not separate things and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think in order to deliver a transition to a decarbonised economy, we do need to think about bringing the public along with us. And the example I give you is offshore wind. I mean, we've now got a situation where we're in at least 3 electorates around the country. Monash in Gippsland, Wannon and Perth. You've got independent candidates who've come out against offshore wind projects. Now, I'm not here to say whether it's good or bad. What I'm saying is that there is a debate about how we transition. So I think that, and it can be achieved, but that's going to be, I think, crucial in the debate because we do have to make sure going forward we've got aspirations that we want to achieve as a country, and if we want to get anywhere close, we've got to sort that out. The only thing I'd add to that list and it would be a long list if we went through everything, is I just think what the implications of a changing world around the advent of the Trump administration Mark II is going to mean for regional partnerships, Australia's role, our self-sufficiency, our partnerships, trade agreements with different countries. I think that is a crucial area of discussion.
Yeah, and I think that generally foreign affairs don't rate that highly in election cycles as kind of issues that people vote on, but I agree with John. I think there's so much disruption internationally. Obviously, the war in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the changes in the dynamics between the United States and the traditional partners, etc., will put a big focus on that, and I think there'll be a very much, this kind of who's best equipped to manage in an unmanageable world, an uncertain world. When people are polled about these things, a lot of Australians rate the the growing divide between rich and poor as a critical issue for them. Australians do see themselves as a fair and egalitarian society and don't feel comfortable with the fact that now 12.7% of the population live below the poverty line. That's 3.1 million Australians are living below the poverty line. 1.2 million children are in households. So people don't like it, but then if you ask the next question about should we change our taxation arrangements so that we can distribute more effectively, they go, hang on, no, don't bring in inheritance tax, and don't change capital gains, and don't. So these things become very difficult. I think absolutely cost of living is a critical issue because those figures have got worse. That polarisation has absolutely got worse, and the amount of wealth that's held by the top 10, 20% of the population has just got bigger and bigger, and so it's real, and we see it in our work, of course, every day. But I think also, in some ways, the focus on what's happening internationally does help people to focus on what is really authentic about Australia. And so I think people love our universal health system. For all its challenges, people want to fight for our universal education system. They see health and education as fairness things, but they also see them as productivity drivers. If people are unhealthy, they're not working productively. If people don't have opportunities for education and training, they can't meet the jobs of the future. So I think you'll see these issues bubble up a bit more. And then, of course, there's always that interesting conversation about the economy. And I always laugh because if you poll people and say, who manages the economy better? People say the Liberals, and then they say who's better for creating jobs and growth, and they say the Labor Party. So it's a bit how you tell the story.
Yes, truth might be somewhere in there. That's a good segue to where I want to go next. We've called this the ethics of voting, and there is one sense in a democracy like ours with compulsory voting that it's one person, one vote. And I've got friends that I've had this conversation with who'll say, well, when I go to the polls, I'm voting for myself. I'm expecting everyone to vote in their own self-interests. As a Christian, I've always been taught that my vote is actually for the good of the community, and with a particular emphasis on those in our community who are vulnerable, who don't have much political or social capital. And, to use the example you just gave, Bronwyn, even when that vote might be against my own self-interest in that I pay more tax because I want universal health care, children lifted out of poverty, etc. So my question to you both is, who should we be voting for when we go to the polls? And what is our, not in terms of party,
Red and blue.
so not in terms of party, but in terms of our moral obligation to one another as a society? And is it ever justified to vote entirely in self-interest?
Well, I would hope that we would all avoid that, because I think as we've been talking about, in this conversation. There are things that will occupy and exercise the public's attention, and other things which are perhaps even more important and carry more momentous consequences for the future of our country and the world, that are not going to make it into the discussion but are of enormous import. So our foreign partnerships, the debate over foreign aid, which is a classic difficult one, which is how does that help me personally? And it takes leadership to be able to say, well, one, it's in the interest of humanity and democracy and peace around the world, but just so you know, it's good for us as well. That's why I'm actually supportive of Australia sending a peacekeeping force to the Ukraine, because I support the people of Ukraine, but also support the international rules-based order, and it's in our interests as well as a citizen of the world, a national citizen of the world, that we do that. So I guess that's a long answer to your question, Robyn, but I would like to think it would be both, that yes, you're entitled to think about how the outcome of an election will affect you and your family and your friends and your community, but I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about the broader good, even if it's not part of the discussion, and to take the time to work through issues, which depends also on political leaders being mature about how that debate unfolds.
I saw some statistics recently that said that 53% of people vote on policy issues which are either broader issues, the kind that John was just talking about, or self-interest. In other words, who's going to give me a bigger tax cut? Who's going to build a bigger swimming pool down the road in my community? Those kinds of things. About 30% will never shift. They are rusted on party political voters, and then the remainder are, tend to be wobbling all over the place. I think also the very first point you made, John, that the polarisation that is well documented in the American system, I think we have some checks and balances in Australia that mean that we do tend to come closer to the centre, and that there is more consensus around the things that really matter for us. But I think it's always a challenge to get people to lift their eyes and their sights beyond themselves. And I'll come back to issues like social dislocation, mental health, these things that people are saying are actually incredibly costly for our society. They have a huge impact on our health budget. They have a huge impact on economic productivity. The more people who are sick and out of the workforce, who are able to work that can't work, it's a direct impact on our economic outcomes as a society. It's much, much harder to get people to focus on those things.
And I might just add, voting is a process I think I know less about this far down in my trajectory political. I remember one of my earliest campaigns, I was standing on a polling booth handing out my material with campaign supporters with me, and I saw this fellow sort of walk through, and he was rejecting everybody's how to vote card. And he comes up to me and goes, "I'll grab one of yours." And I thought, great. And so I handed it to him. He goes, "I'll take yours because there's no way I'm voting for that John Pesutto." So I don't know.
I must say,
I've been perplexed at election time.
Yeah. There have been election days when I see people take the pamphlets and read them as if they're thinking about their vote for the first time, and I probably am thinking fairly judgmental thoughts at that point. But I'm going to channel now not a major party, the people not in the room. Last election we saw this massive swing to independence and the famous Teals. I think some of that was around, this general distrust of institutions and government. I think some of that was around people feeling that their kind of values, these big issues they care about, whether it's the environment, Aboriginal justice, at one end of the spectrum, maybe at the other end it's migration and a sense that the world is changing and I no longer have the opportunities I once had. But they're not seeing their values reflected in the major parties. Is this a good for our democracy to have more breadth in Parliament? Is it a wake-up call to the major parties to say there's something you're missing about what people care about? How do we read that as a sign of the times and about people, what people are actually saying about what they care about?
There's always that line that major parties give, and John and I would have given it out. I think when we were on the radio together, we kind of had a shared disdain for minor parties. But I'll get to that, because I think the fact that 30% of people are voting for minor parties means that's a very, very silly position to hold. But, you know, there is that strong argument that if you want to get something done in society, you actually need a government to get that done. And today, the major parties have been able to form government, pass laws, pass legislation, and get stuff done. I think the fact that we have got the growth of minor parties, it's going to be interesting to see whether we genuinely will move to a more multi-party system in Australia. We are pretty unique that we've had the dominance of the Reds and the Blues. And, you know, the coalitions are very, as we know, in European countries. I mean, we're not suggesting no insult to your ancestors, John, but we really don't want to go down the Italian pathway. But, you know, it is very common to have that kind of system, and the forcing of coalitions, the forcing of people working together across disparate groups, some people say may not be an unhealthy thing for our democracy.
Yeah, I always start with the proposition that people never get it wrong, and I've had to accept that even when I lost my seat the first time, you know, in 2018. So I look at this, the advent of a large number of independents, say in the federal parliament, with an acceptance that that's what the people wanted, and that's, you've got to respect that outcome and try to discern what lessons you can out of it. Without wanting to draw any sympathy from an intelligent audience that's not going to give me any. Life in a major party, I'm not sure what Bronwyn's view on this is, but life in a major party is hard, particularly today, because I can tell you in my party, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in my party, there's a huge diversity of views. There are people who would be on the more moderate end, people who would be on the more conservative end, people who are more dogmatic, people who are more pragmatic. They're very different dynamic axes, by the way, in my view. But you get that very wide range of views, and for a major party on difficult issues, whether it's identity type issues, whether it's education and the role of, say, independent education versus government education in a world where people want choice, or how to tackle the housing crisis, all of these things, we agonise over these things internally as well. But as a major political brand, if I can use that word, not to dumb the discussion down, it's very hard to maintain that kind of presence that both major parties had for decades in the system, when it's actually very easy today for people on different parts of the spectrum to raise their profile, campaign, and that's a good thing. You want your democracy to be accessible to everyone without needing to raise squillions of dollars. But ultimately, as easier as it is now for independents and minor parties to emerge, they face the same difficulties sooner or later. So if you take the Greens Party, for example, they will struggle to get beyond the 20%-ish kind of cohort of the voting population, because sooner or later you have to start making choices about where you want to sit on things, whereas if you're an independent or a minor party, I'm not saying this as a criticism, it's a reality though, is that you can take shots at Labor and Liberal, which may well be fair game. I'm not saying it's not fair game. It's an open process, but if you want to become a major presence, then you have to do what we have to try and do, not always successfully, which is bring broad coalitions of people together. So what do I think will happen? I think both major parties learn the lessons. It's engage more, take nothing for granted. No seat is unwinnable or unlosable. And I know that from personal experience. And I think if the major parties understand that, and we're seeing something happen in the west of Melbourne, for example, where, you know, one of my priorities as leader was we've never seriously presented ourselves out there. So from the day I became leader, I was out there constantly and in the north. I mean, the point I was making is the whole of the state, the whole of the country should be one massive marginal seat where every square inch of the country is fought over. And
you might be interested to know, well, you probably do know, John, that the Socialist Alternative polled higher than the Greens in the last federal election in most of the seats in the west of Melbourne. So that reinforces. But John's right, life within the major party is tough work, and I can tell you sometimes it was a lot easier to have friends on the other side of the aisle than it was to have friends in your own party. They're highly competitive, competing for ideas, competing for power. As a minister, everyone wants your job, and so you just got to watch for the knives the whole time. But it is a microcosm of the whole community. And it's a very robust environment.
Well, and thank you both for having done it and doing it. It's obviously a privilege and I suspect at times damn difficult. Let me pivot to the topic of religion, and you can pass on this if you want. There is a sense that the religious landscape in Australia is shifting as well, and yet in Parliament there's still the Lord's Prayer. There's a quote in the 1879 vestibule of Parliament House from Proverbs 11, which is a biblical book about in the multitude of counsellors there is safety. So we have elements of the Christian tradition from the last couple of hundred years deeply embedded in our political system in certain ways. And yet there's equally this, I think, quite strong push from some quarters to keep religion out of politics, as if people, as my minister said last Sunday, who are humanists or atheists don't bring a set of values and ethics into the room out of their own belief systems. What do you think the role of religion is in politics, and how realistic is this, leave your faith at the door kind of stuff you hear? And maybe even from inside those party rooms you've talked about, how friendly is it to people being honest about the kind of ethics and values and beliefs that actually drive them? Say what you feel you can say.
Look, I have always been a strong supporter of people bringing their values, and if that's a reflection of a faith-based outlook on issues, then for me that's perfectly legitimate if people want to bring that. Equally, if people don't want to bring that, they shouldn't be penalised or subject to any kind of disadvantage or exclusion because of that. I've never accepted that there's something that should attract some sort of pejorative about your religious beliefs. I personally, I've a Catholic background. I can't say I was ever Employee of the Month, but I'm still a card-carrying member. But for me, it's a very personal thing, so I don't. And I think for most people, it is. It's a very kind of private thing, but I certainly encourage it. For me, you talk about the Lord's Prayer, Robyn, and issues around that. For me, it's an institutional part of the Parliament, if for nothing else, for its sort of solemn history and the evocation of a contemplative approach to legislating. So I think there's a place for that history in the Parliament, and for me, people will disagree with this, a wide range of views, but that's my view. So I think religious values are okay, and you can't pretend they're not part of who you are. Yep. But it's the policy process and the parliamentary process that should sort all of that out, as I said earlier. I think the majority of people who have that kind of religious spirituality, I think all of us in our own way have our own ways of contemplating with the unknowns and the momentous nature of the universe and all of those deep questions. But I don't think there's anything untoward in people having their religious views.
Yep, thank you.
I had a look at that verse in Proverbs, and there was a couple that sort of were either side of it. One was, extorting people against the evils of gossiping. And the other, I think a bit further on in the chapter, it was, about how terrible vindictiveness was. And I did used to always chuckle when the Lord's Prayer was read at the beginning of the day, when we got to the forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, and it being solemnly read, and I thought, that's never going to happen in here, in this place. As many of you know, I went into Parliament not many years later from having worked in the Synod, and as a member of the Uniting Church. And what I found, actually, there was actually quite a lot of preconceived ideas of what Christian people were like. They're kind of like God botherers, and they were going to be very socially conservative. So, you came from the church, so you're going to vote against the abortion. You're going to vote against dying with dignity legislation. You're going to. So a lot of stereotypes about. But I also found that in the end, it's all about values, as John has said, and it's all about if people share the values of care and compassion, of wanting to do the best for society, of fairness, of justice, of the rule of law, all of those things, then there's amazing camaraderie. So, but we live in a very pluralistic society, and I think for Christians to think that they've got some special set of rights, even though we do have a heritage, I think is arrogant, to be honest. We need to work with others of goodwill to get good things done.
Yeah. And I think for me it's why I resist the narrative of keep your faith private. It's obviously personal, but private suggests it doesn't impact. Yeah. And I think if we were more honest as a society, whether you're an atheist or a Sikh or a Christian or whatever, the reality is our belief systems do impact our...
But it's not. But equally, it's not everything, in my view, Robyn.
Okay.
It's your values play a huge part, but there's also the facts.
Yes.
And there are issues, and I'm sure Bronwyn's had this experience too. There are issues that you'll approach at the start of a public discussion about a particular priority that's coming onto the agenda, and you have some early views on it and some preferential outlooks on that issue. But as you start to talk to people across and affected by that debate, all of a sudden you realise, well, that's my view and that's my experience and my truth about that issue. But I've spoken to a range of people who have a very different outlook. And I think it's important for us all to remember that, because to get to that point where we reach outcomes, sometimes you have to move, but sometimes you hope you can convince others to move.
Yes.
And that's not always easy.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And one of the phrases we use is when we describe ourselves as the Wesley Centre is research informed. That is, even in matters of faith, research and facts need to be informing our worldview. Like, it's not just opinion or belief against all rational argument and what the research suggests.
And you can see how, I know we don't want to talk about Donald Trump, but we can see how religion can also be used in a manipulative kind of way. I love the Bible. It's my favourite book. I've got lots of copies of it.
Yes. Has he read it? We're not so sure. In a moment, I'm going to throw up... So I've got a colleague here, the Reverend Dr. Craig Thompson, who I've asked to be a bit of a reflector today. So in a moment, I'm going to throw to him for a comment and a question. But just before I do that, I'm just interested if either of you have any advice for people out there who might be passionate about a particular issue. How can we engage our politicians? What's actually effective? Is it writing the letter or the email? Is it phoning up? Is it signing petitions? How do we actually engage constructively as voters in the political process?
All of those things and more. I mean, I'd encourage any of you and others who might sort of watch this later, there are lots of ways to get involved, and you'd be surprised, I think pleasantly so, at how receptive members of Parliament and ministers will be to hearing from. Even if they ultimately can't do what you want them to do, people will engage with you. Yeah. And There are other ways to get involved. There are parliamentary inquiries that you can make submissions to. The sky's the limit on getting involved. You just got to have that passion and the spark, and I hope what we've discussed today, Bronwyn, gives people that spark to get involved.
I did want to mention civics education because, latest CARA recently did some research and only 40% of kids in our schools are getting any decent civics education, and I think that's a real problem. I think people do need to learn about how the political system works to get a deeper understanding and restore some confidence in the fact that it can work and it can bring about good laws. And, if you look at over history, there's some amazing advances that we've made in our society through the cooperation of people in the parliamentary democracy system. But I think it's also, one particular issue, you can contact your local member, etc. But I do think movements are important. And the more people who are engaged and the more people that you can bring around you to have a passion over a certain issue or want to bring about change, then the more effective it is, because in the end that's what politics is about. It's about trying to lead and do the best for the largest group of people.
Thank you. When Robyn asked me to speak or to make a response, I said to myself, I hope they say something interesting, that I might be able to make an interesting response to, and you've said many interesting things, so thank you. I want to focus on the question of the ethics of voting and what we think we're doing when we vote, because it seems to me that it might be the case that our vote bears a lot more weight for us these days than perhaps once it did. One of the things that's happened in our society has been a decline of subsidiarity in our society. So, huge places like this built to hold 1,000 people do not anymore. The church has diminished, the trade unions have diminished, many other social groups within our wider society have diminished as sub-political presences, different organised voices to address the wider society. And in their absence, what's taken place is we've centralised more. So we're probably more these days Victorians and Australians than we are Methodists or Unionists or those kinds of things, a bit of a shift. And in the absence of that organised alternative voice, we now have the disorganised alternative voices, which is the social media kind of thing. So that when we think about solutions for our community, we think now in terms of state and government rather than the local groups, school activity and so forth, and a radical decline in local political participation. So that's an observation that doesn't finish with a question mark so much as a discuss. But I'm interested in is that an adequate account of the way in which our political life has shifted in the last 2 or 3 generations? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? What could we do about it? Because it seems to me it serves certain types of governance very well to be centralised and not to have those alternative voices operating in the community.
It's the kind of, the Robert Putnam Bowling Alone work that was done in the US. I think he wrote that book in the 70s or the 80s, about the decline, in that case he used the image of people used to go 10-pin bowling and bowling clubs, and how all of those clubs and societies, as you've described, Craig, have largely diminished, and that sort of civil society now being smaller kind of puts a stronger focus on government, because before kind of we used to solve it for ourselves. And this place, the founder of Wesley Mission did all its early stuff with no government funding whatsoever, no engagement until, we kind of got the welfare state in the following century. So the focus then does become on government to kind of reflect our collective aspirations, and of course then the judgment comes because we can't always do it very well as government. I always say to people though, if you kind of are one of the 1.7 that either doesn't vote or the extra group that votes, you are all a pack of idiots on your voting card. It's like you're leaving a hole, so you're creating a vacuum for others to fill, because if you don't get in there and participate, then others will on your behalf, and you might not like what they do. So it's not an answer. It's about, I guess, people being conscious and aware and thoughtful and creative in trying to pull people together to have a bigger say.
Yeah, they're good observations from Bronwyn. I would only add, Craig, that politics is in a state of constant evolution. So for me, I'm a bit more of an optimist when it comes to these things, and I don't despair at the polarity. It's just a phase, and we work our way through what has been thus since the dawn of time. I've actually spoken about where people gather today. So in congregations, the numbers aren't as strong as they used to be. But it occurs to me there are other organisations that have emerged which bring people together. So I've always been interested in this question of where do people congregate, because we're naturally hardwired as beings to generally congregate. And one of the areas, it's not the complete answer, but if you look at sporting clubs today, for example, at a community level, once upon a time a football and a netball club just posted a team out on the pitch on a Saturday or a Sunday, might have had a barbecue, and that was it. But if you deal with them now, as Bronwyn would have as an MP as well, you go to them now, they'll have a diversity program, they'll have a mental health program, and they'll have events, they'll have speakers. It's not the same thing, but the same thing's going on, where people are coming together for company, for guidance, for pastoral care, all manner of healthy things. So I'm not despairing to the point where people don't associate anymore or congregate, and we've got to try and support those. I'd love to see congregations strong as they once were. Might not happen, but still got a vital role to play. The other thing I'd say about people who can participate more directly in politics, it's kind of what we've always wanted. I mean, we always wanted people to be active and have individual agency in the health of our democracy. And decades ago, 100 years ago, politics was largely what I'd call a corporatist model. You had the ACTU, but you equally on the other side, you had the Business Council or the trades associations, and they made decisions on behalf of everybody. And that's just one example, but across society, those large institutional players don't play the role they once played, and we can all have an individual part to play. So with that reality, though, comes the responsibility, and I always talk about all of us in democracy having that responsibility. So if someone wants to criticise me about something I've said or done, or not said or done, they can do it, but they have the responsibilities, as we've spoken about, to do it in a way which is honouring, the health of our democracy. So I think it's changing, but we've always got to find the virtues to support and the shortcomings to remedy.
Thank you. Some of the things I've heard today is that we have this obligation in all of us to engage in the political process. It is worth engaging our local politicians, writing letters, expressing our feelings about the issues we care about. And of course, you're all here, which suggests you're already engaged, but talk to people in your lives who may be less engaged in the political process and get them thinking early about the federal election, whenever that might be. Before we thank our speakers, next month we're pivoting to something a little bit different. Dr. Brian McCallum, who is a philosopher, theologian, author of a book called Forgiving God. He's a cancer survivor. We're going to be having a conversation about facing death and mortality in a death-denying culture. And we're going to be reflecting on how we think about suffering, God, death, and the world. So come along for that if you would like to. And just because it's in a church doesn't mean you can't bring your coffee or your sandwich. We know you need to eat. So don't feel you've got to be a bit precious. It's a space to use, and bring your food with you. Can we lastly thank Bronwyn Pike and John Pesutto. Thank you so much for making time for this in the midst of your busy, busy lives.
Absolute pleasure.
We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.